The music from the upscale bar wraps around me like velvet, rich and suffocating, and Philip's fingers dig into my wrist with that familiar pressure that lives between insistence and pain. His cologne overwhelms my senses, expensive and cloying, a scent that used to mean safety before I understood what lived beneath his polished surface. Come on, Clara, let's just talk. His voice carries that threatening sweetness I know too well. The tone that always preceded hours of circular arguments designed to wear me down until I couldn't remember my own thoughts. The bar is crowded with the after-work elite, their laughter and conversation creating a wall of sound that should make me feel safe, but instead highlights my isolation because none of these strangers will intervene in what looks like a lover's quarrel. My heart hammers against my ribs, panic rising like bile, because Philip has been everywhere I turn for 3 weeks since I made it clear we were finished, showing up at my apartment, my workplace, the grocery store, always with that same reasonable expression that makes me feel crazy for being afraid. I need him gone, need to breathe, need something to shift in this nightmare that my life has become. That's when I see him at the bar, dark hair and a profile sharp enough to cut, radiating danger the way other men radiate cologne. He's alone despite the crowd pressing close, an island of expensive suit and coiled power that makes the space around him feel charged with warning. Something in my desperate brain sparks with reckless inspiration. I wrench my wrist from Philip's grip, ignoring his startled protest, and cross the distance to the stranger before fear or common sense can stop me. His eyes lift as I approach, ice blue and predatory, tracking my movement with an intensity that should terrify me. And maybe it does, but terror has become my constant companion, so what's one more source? I don't let myself hesitate, just step into his space, rise on my toes, and press my lips to his, feeling his body go rigid with surprise beneath my trembling hands. Please, I breathe against his mouth. Just play along, please. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing happens, and I think I've made a catastrophic mistake. Kissed a stranger who will shove me away and leave me more vulnerable than before. Then his hand slides to my waist, large and possessive and burning through the thin fabric of my blouse, pulling me closer with casual strength. The kiss shifts, becomes real, his mouth moving against mine with controlled expertise that makes my knees weak for reasons having nothing to do with fear. When I pull back, gasping, his ice blue eyes study me with an intensity that catalogs every detail of my face, my fear, my desperation, reading me like text on a page. Clara! Philip's voice cuts through the moment, tight with barely suppressed fury. The stranger's gaze shifts past me, landing on Philip, and something cold and deadly flickers through his expression. His arm remains around my waist, a brand of possession that should make me bolt, but instead makes me feel anchored for the first time in weeks. The stranger looks at Philip the way a wolf looks at something small and foolish. No aggression needed when superiority is absolute. I'm Alexander. His voice is dark velvet and controlled violence. And the lady is with me. The words carry finality, an ending to a discussion that hasn't started, and I feel Philip hesitate behind me, his territorial anger colliding with some instinct that recognizes danger. I don't turn to watch him leave, too focused on the man still holding me, whose thumb now traces my jawline with unsettling gentleness. So, Alexander says softly, those predatory eyes fixed on mine. What exactly have you gotten yourself into? Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. I try to pull away, to thank him and escape back into the crowd where I can disappear and pretend this never happened, but Alexander's hand remains at my waist. Fingers spread possessive and warm against the small of my back, anchoring me to his side with effortless strength. His ice blue eyes track Philip's retreat through the bar with the cold calculation of a predator assessing whether prey requires further attention, and something in that clinical evaluation sends a new kind of fear threading through my chest, because I'm suddenly aware I know nothing about this man whose mouth I just kissed. How long has he been following you? Alexander asks, his voice conversational, but his gaze still tracking movement through the crowd. And the question is so precisely aimed at the heart of my situation that my breath catches. I notice then how the bar's other patrons give us space, how the bartender nods with careful deference when Alexander's attention sweeps past, how even the music seems to lower in volume around his presence, like the room itself recognizes hierarchy I'm only beginning to perceive. A few weeks, I manage, my voice steadier than I feel, and I should leave, should thank you and go. But his thumb traces a slow circle against my spine that makes coherent thought difficult. Alexander's mouth curves slightly, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement of something I haven't said. Your ex is waiting outside, he says with certainty that shouldn't be possible unless he can see through walls or has people reporting to him, and fear spikes cold through my veins because Philip angry is dangerous, but Philip humiliated is worse. I must make some sound or movement that betrays my panic because Alexander's attention finally leaves the room and focuses entirely on me with an intensity that feels like standing in a spotlight. He pulls his phone from his pocket, never releasing me, and speaks in low tones to someone named James about a car and a back exit and making sure the path is clear. When he guides me toward the rear of the bar, his hand shifts to my lower back, the touch somehow both protective and possessive, a claiming that should make me bolt, but instead makes me feel safer than I have in weeks of looking over my shoulder. The back hallway is dim and narrow, leading past storage rooms and kitchen noise, emerging into an alley where a black luxury car waits with running lights and a driver who doesn't look surprised to see us. Alexander opens the rear door, hand cupping my elbow as I slide inside onto leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and I should protest, should insist I can get home on my own, but he's already joining me, and the door closes with the solid sound of expensive engineering. Who are you? I demand as the car pulls smoothly into traffic, because men don't command this kind of immediate response without power that comes with complications. Alexander studies me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the passing streetlights, before saying that men like my ex don't stop until they're made to stop. And I can hear in his tone an understanding of violence that comes from intimate familiarity. He offers his protection with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to solving problems through application of force and resources, but I can sense strings attached to the offer, hooks hidden beneath velvet promises. I can handle it myself, I insist, though my hands trembling in my lap betray the lie, and Alexander's gaze drops to those shaking fingers with something almost like sympathy. The car turns onto my street without me giving directions, pulls up in front of my building with precision that makes my blood run ice cold. How do you know where I live? The question comes out frightened and small. Alexander's expression doesn't change, as he says simply that he makes it his business to know things, and the casual way he admits to having information he shouldn't possess is somehow more terrifying than Philip's obvious stalking. He walks me to my door, his presence overwhelming in the narrow hallway with its flickering fluorescent lights and worn carpet, standing too close while I fumble with keys. Before he leaves, Alexander produces a card from his pocket, black with a single phone number embossed in silver, pressing it into my palm. Call me when he comes back, Alexander says, holding my gaze. Not if, I notice. When? The certainty in his voice terrifies me more than anything else tonight, because he's right. Philip will come back. And somehow this beautiful, dangerous stranger knows it, with the assurance of someone who understands exactly how men like Philip think, which means he might be something far more dangerous than the protection I desperately need. The morning light filters through Eleanor's kitchen window where we sit with coffee that's gone cold, my hands still shaking slightly as I recount everything from last night. From Philip's grip on my wrist, to the desperate kiss, to Alexander's ice-blue eyes, and the way he knew where I lived without being told. Eleanor's eyes grow wider with each detail, her coffee mug frozen halfway to her mouth, and when I finish, she sets it down carefully like she's handling something explosive before pulling out her phone with fingers that move fast across the screen. "Clara," she says slowly, "do you know who Alexander Sinclair is?" And there's something in her voice that makes my stomach drop even before she turns the phone toward me. The screen shows news articles, society page photos, business profiles, all featuring the man whose mouth I kissed, whose hand burned possession into my waist. Alexander Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, one of the city's most successful import companies. Photographed at charity galas and business conferences, always alone, always commanding every room, like gravity bends around him. Eleanor scrolls further, and her voice drops lower as she shows me the other articles. The ones from smaller publications and crime blogs. Speculation about Sinclair Enterprises being a front for organized crime, about shipments that don't quite add up, about Alexander's father who built an empire that straddled legal and illegal before dying, in circumstances the police called suspicious. "You need to stay away from him," Eleanor insists, her hand covering mine. "He's dangerous, Clara. Like actually dangerous. Not Philip's pathetic controlling dangerous, but real criminal underworld dangerous." I know she's right. Know that I should throw away the black card with its silver embossed number and pretend last night never happened. But I can't stop thinking about the way Alexander looked at me, like I was something precious and dangerous at once, or the certainty in his voice when he said Philip would come back. The day passes in distracted anxiety, my attention fragmenting between customers at the cafe where I work as manager, my mind replaying the feel of Alexander's hand at my waist, the predatory intelligence in those ice blue eyes. By closing time, I've almost convinced myself that last night was an aberration, that Philip will leave me alone now that he knows I have someone, even if that someone terrifies me almost as much. Then the cafe door opens at 9:47 p.m., 13 minutes before I lock up, and Philip walks in with fury written across his face in lines I know too well. "The last customer left 10 minutes ago, my assistant manager clocked out early, and the realization that I'm alone hits the same moment Philip crosses the space between us. "Who the hell was that last night?" he demands, his hand clamping around my arm hard enough that I know there will be bruises shaped like fingerprints. "Did you really think you could humiliate me like that? Parade some new boyfriend in front of me like I'm nothing?" I try to pull away, but his grip tightens, his other hand rising toward my face in a gesture that could be tender or threatening, and fear floods cold through my veins because I recognize this escalation, this rage that Philip always kept carefully hidden beneath his reasonable surface. "You're hurting me," I manage, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to leave, Philip. We're done." But he's not hearing me anymore, his hand moving from my face to my throat, pressing me back against the counter with pressure that makes breathing difficult. His face is close to mine, twisted with possessive fury, and he's saying things about how I belong to him, how I can't just leave, how he'll make me understand, and terror claws up my throat because the cafe is empty, and the street outside is dark, and no one knows I'm here alone with him. Some survival instinct takes over, and I bring my knee up hard into his groin, feeling him grunt and loosen his grip just enough for me to wrench free and run for the back office, my fingers fumbling with the lock as Philip pounds after me, his footsteps heavy and his voice rising to a roar that promises violence. The door locks just as he reaches it, his fists hammering against the wood hard enough to rattle the frame, and I back into the corner with my phone in shaking hands, Alexander's card pulled from my pocket, where I've been carrying it like a talisman I hoped I wouldn't need. The silence after Philip's footsteps fade away stretches impossibly long, my heartbeat thundering in my ears so loud I almost miss the sound of the front door opening again. Different footsteps entering the cafe, purposeful and controlled. Alexander answers on the first ring when I call, his voice sharp with something between concern and command. And I can barely whisper what happened, my throat still feeling the ghost pressure of Philip's hand, my voice breaking on the words he tried to choke me. "Stay locked in that office," Alexander says with absolute certainty. "I'll be there in 8 minutes, and something in his tone makes me believe those 8 minutes are a promise he'll move heaven and earth to keep. But it's only 7 minutes before I hear the office door handle tested gently, then Alexander's voice low and controlled saying my name, asking me to open the door. It's safe now. My hands shake so badly I can barely work the lock, and when the door swings open, Alexander fills the doorway with another man beside him, dark-haired and similar enough in features that I know this is family before Alexander introduces him as James, his brother. Alexander's ice-blue eyes sweep over me in an assessment that catalogues every detail, his gaze lingering on my arm where Philip's fingers left marks already darkening to bruises, and something in his expression goes absolutely cold. A deadly kind of calm that's more terrifying than rage. James moves past us to the cafe's back office where the security system lives, his movements efficient and purposeful, while Alexander crouches before where I've collapsed into the desk chair, bringing himself to my eye level instead of looming over me. His hands reach for my arm with a gentleness that's stark contrast to the violence promised in his eyes, fingers careful as they examine the bruises, and I watch his jaw clench with each mark he finds. "Tell me about Philip," Alexander says quietly. "Not the surface details, but the patterns. How long this has been escalating, what you've already tried to make it stop." The questions are precise, and I find myself answering, explaining the 6 months since I left him, the stalking that started subtle, then grew bolder, the police reports that went nowhere because Philip's family has money and lawyers who make problems disappear. Alexander listens with an intensity that makes me feel heard in a way the police never did, and when I finish he explains in that dark velvet voice that Philip won't stop because men like him view women as property, as things they own, and the only language they understand is consequences more severe than their entitlement. I know I should refuse whatever Alexander is offering, should insist on handling this through proper legal channels, even though those channels have failed me repeatedly. But the fear still coursing cold through my veins makes me weak and desperate. Alexander proposes an arrangement with the calm of someone negotiating a business contract. I'll be under his protection, appear to be his in public, and Philip will be handled permanently. No more looking over my shoulder or jumping at shadows. In return, I'll accompany him to business functions, maintain the appearance of a relationship, be seen at his side when it matters. "Nothing I don't agree to," he promises, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that steals my breath. "But the world needs to believe you belong to me completely, because that's the only claim Philip and men like him will respect." The word belonging should repel me, should trigger every instinct that fought to escape Philip's possessive cage, but instead, something dark and needy deep inside responds to it, to the idea of being claimed by someone powerful enough to make me safe. This is a deal with the devil, I know it with absolute certainty. But when Alexander's thumb brushes across my cheekbone with unexpected tenderness, wiping away a tear I didn't realize had fallen, I hear myself agree in a voice barely above a whisper. His smile is triumphant and possessive at once, satisfaction gleaming in those ice-blue eyes, and he rises smoothly to his feet, telling James to drive me home while he stays to review the security footage and make some calls, his tone suggesting those calls will involve things I'm better off not knowing about. The morning after James drives me home, after Alexander stays behind to make his calls and review footage and do whatever dark things he does that make Philip's voice go high with fear, I wake to pounding on my apartment door at 9 a.m. sharp and find two men in expensive suits who introduce themselves as working for Mr. Sinclair with instructions that I'm to pack essentials because I'm moving today. Fury floods hot through my veins at his high-handedness, at the assumption that he can just rearrange my life without discussion, and I pull out my phone to call that single number on the black card with fingers that shake from anger instead of fear this time. Alexander answers on the second ring, his voice carrying that maddening calm that makes me want to throw something, and before I can launch into my objections, he explains with infuriating logic that Philip knows where I live, that he almost certainly made copies of my key during our relationship, the way controlling men always do. That my building has no security beyond a broken intercom system, and until Philip is properly handled, I'm vulnerable here in ways that make Alexander's careful control fracture around the edges. The logic is sound, I hate that it's sound, but the control still chafes against every instinct that fought for independence these past 6 months. I want to argue, want to insist on maintaining some autonomy, but Alexander offers to come discuss it in person if I prefer, and something in his tone suggests that conversation will end the same way, but with his physical presence overwhelming my space and better judgment. He arrives 30 minutes later, despite what I know must be a significant distance from wherever he was, filling my small living room with his presence in a way that makes the modest space feel tiny and shabby. His expensive suit and controlled power at odds with my thrift store furniture and second-hand everything. We argue, my voice rising as I insist on maintaining some thread of independence. Alexander immovable as stone on the security issue, his voice never rising but going quieter and more dangerous. The way I'm learning means he's reached his limit. The tension between us crackles like electricity, my fear and anger mixing with an attraction I don't want to acknowledge, don't want to feel toward a man who casually rearranges lives and makes people disappear. Alexander steps closer, crowding into my space with deliberate intent, his voice dropping to that dark velvet tone that does things to my nervous system I refuse to examine closely. He reminds me that this was my choice, kissing a stranger in a bar to escape. And now I have his protection, his resources, his complete and undivided attention. Does I truly want to walk away from that? Walk back into being vulnerable and alone with Philip, circling like a predator who knows his prey is wounded? His fingers reach out to trace the bruises Philip left on my arm, the touch feather light and careful, but I watch rage flash through Alexander's ice-blue eyes at the visible evidence of another man's hands on me. I see the barely leashed violence in him then, understand with perfect clarity that he's dangerous in ways Philip never dreamed of being. But somehow I also feel safer than I have in months standing in his presence. I agree to stay at his property temporarily, just until the Philip situation is resolved, and Alexander's smile is pure masculine satisfaction. His penthouse is obscenely luxurious when we arrive, all floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and modern elegance that speaks of wealth I've only seen in magazines, and he shows me to a guest room that's larger than my entire apartment, promising that I control the locks, that nothing happens without my consent. But that night, I can't sleep, hyper-aware of Alexander's presence down the hall, and at 2 a.m. I find myself wandering to discover him still awake in his study, working with shirt sleeves rolled up and looking dangerously attractive in the desk lamp's glow. He looks up when I appear in the doorway wearing sleep shorts and an old t-shirt, and something heated flashes through his eyes that makes my skin feel too tight before he carefully banks it and asks if I need anything. His voice gone rough in a way that suggests he's thinking of things I need that have nothing to do with comfortable sleeping arrangements. 3 days after settling into the guest room that feels more like a luxury hotel suite than temporary housing, Alexander appears at breakfast, with the announcement that I'll be accompanying him to a charity gala tonight, his tone making it clear this isn't a request, but the beginning of our arrangement's public performance. A stylist arrives by noon with garment bags containing dresses that cost more than 6 months of my cafe salary, and I choose a deep emerald gown because the color makes me feel armored and exposed at once, like I'm going into battle wearing silk and strategic cut lines. When I emerge from my room that evening, my hair styled in soft waves and makeup applied with more skill than I've ever managed alone, Alexander is waiting in the living room, and his expression shifts from patient to pure possession in the span of a heartbeat. He crosses to me with predatory grace, pulling a jewelry box from his pocket and extracting a diamond necklace that catches the light like captured stars. And when he fastens it around my throat, his fingers linger against my skin long enough that I feel my pulse jump beneath his touch. At the gala held in a museum transformed by wealth and careful lighting, I realize with crystalline clarity that the performance begins now. that every eye in this room will catalog and judge and speculate about the woman at Alexander Sinclair's side. He keeps me close with his hand constantly on me, at my lower back or waist, or woven through my fingers, introducing me simply as his to the endless parade of business leaders and politicians and society figures whose faces I recognize from news articles. The looks we receive range from envious to calculating to fearful, and I notice the undercurrents in every interaction, the careful dance of power and influence playing out in polite conversation and strategic positioning. Alexander navigates this world with ease, born of a lifetime's practice, but I see the way men defer to him with subtle body language, the way women's smiles turn brittle when he doesn't return their interest, the way certain individuals fade back into the crowd rather than risk his attention. Then I see Philip across the room with his family, dressed in expensive formal wear and laughing at something his father said, and my body goes rigid with recognition and old fear. Alexander feels the change immediately, his hand tightening on my waist as he follows my gaze, and his expression goes cold in that way I'm learning means someone just made a serious mistake. Philip starts toward us with purpose and barely concealed rage, but James intercepts him with a smile that's all teeth and menace, steering him away with a hand on his shoulder that looks casual but must hurt based on Philip's wince. Alexander turns me into his arms with deliberate intent, forcing my attention away from Philip and onto him, his ice blue eyes holding mine with an intensity that blocks out the rest of the room. "Do you trust me?" he asks in a voice low enough that only I can hear, and the question is enormous, loaded with implications about this moment and everything beyond it. I realize with shock that despite everything, despite the danger and the arrangement and the violence simmering beneath his controlled surface, I do trust him in ways I never trusted Philip, even before things turned dark. Alexander kisses me then, slow and claiming and absolutely public, his hand cupping my face while the other splays possessively across my lower back. And it's for show, I tell myself, even as my body responds by melting into him like I was made to fit against him exactly this way. When he pulls back, his eyes are dark with genuine desire that has nothing to do with performance, and the line between what's real and what's arrangement blurs until I can't find it anymore. Through the crowd, I catch a glimpse of Philip being escorted toward the exit by security, his face red with humiliation and rage. And Alexander leans down to whisper against my ear that Philip has been officially warned and that I'm untouchable now, his breath warm on my skin, and his words a promise that sounds like a vow. Back at the penthouse, the air between us crackles with electricity and unspoken things, charged in a way that makes my skin feel too tight and my breathing shallow. I should go to my room, retreat to the safety of locked doors and distance, but I find myself lingering in the living room as Alexander moves to the bar and pours whiskey into crystal glasses with hands that are perfectly steady despite the tension radiating from his broad shoulders. He has removed his jacket and tie, the first two buttons of his white shirt undone to reveal the strong column of his throat, and he looks less controlled than I have ever seen him, almost human in a way that makes my heart beat faster. He hands me a glass without asking if I want it, and when our fingers brush, the contact feels deliberately prolonged. We sit on opposite ends of the leather sofa, but the space between us feels charged. And then we talk, really talk, for the first time since this arrangement began. Alexander tells me about his family business, in a voice gone low and almost reflective, how his father built an empire that straddled the line between legal and illegal with careful precision, how Alexander inherited both the company and all its complications at 24, when his father was killed in what the police called a robbery, but everyone knew was an execution. There is pain beneath his controlled exterior when he speaks of it, a loneliness in his admission that everyone in his life wants something from him, power or money or protection, that no one has looked at him as simply a man in years beyond counting. I share my own story in halting words, the relationship with Philip that started sweet and slowly became a cage built of criticism and control. How I lost myself trying to keep peace and walk on eggshells. The 6 months since I finally left, spent looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. Alexander listens with an intensity that makes me feel truly seen for the first time since this started, his ice blue eyes never leaving my face. And I realize he is cataloging every word like it matters, like I matter beyond the arrangement we made. He asks why I kissed him that night in the bar, what made me choose him out of everyone in that crowded space. I admit I saw someone powerful enough to make Philip back down, but also something in his eyes that made me gamble he would not hurt me, some core of control that promised safety, even wrapped in danger. Alexander sets down his glass and moves closer, crowding into my space on the sofa until I can smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. And he asks in a voice gone rough what I see in his eyes now. Desire, I answer honestly, and danger, and something almost vulnerable that he tries to hide behind all that control. The kiss this time is not for show or performance. It is hungry and desperate, weeks of tension igniting between us like a match to gasoline, his hands cupping my face while mine fist in his shirt trying to pull him closer. Clara responds without thinking, her body melting into his like it was made to fit exactly this way, until reality crashes back with the weight of everything this complicates. She pulls away, confused and overwhelmed, her lips feeling swollen and her heart racing. This is not real, she reminds them both, her voice shaking. It is an arrangement, temporary protection, not whatever this is becoming. Alexander's jaw clenches, a muscle ticking there as he visibly fights for control, but he lets her go, his hands dropping away even though his eyes stay locked on hers with an intensity that feels like a physical touch. He watches as she retreats to her room like she is running from a fire, and alone in the darkness, Clara touches her lips with trembling fingers, terrified by how much she wanted to stay, how much she wants things that were never part of the deal they made. The next week passes in strange domesticity, punctuated by Alexander's absences for business that he never fully explains, and I return to work at the cafe needing some semblance of normal life. But now James or another of Alexander's men shadows me constantly with professional vigilance that should feel suffocating, but instead brings relief I don't want to examine too closely. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor arrives at the cafe, panicked and pale, her hands shaking as she tells me that Philip came to her apartment the night before looking for me, that he grabbed her arm and threatened her when she refused to give information about where I'm staying, his rage barely contained and his eyes wild in a way that terrified her. I call Alexander immediately with ice flooding my veins, and he arrives within 8 minutes with fury barely contained beneath his controlled exterior, every line of his body taut with violence waiting to be unleashed. This is escalation, he explains in a voice gone cold and analytical. Philip is probing for weaknesses and testing boundaries, and Eleanor needs protection too, whether she wants it or not. Alexander makes calls right there in the cafe, his tone brooking no argument as he assigns security to Eleanor, who is both terrified by the reality of the danger and awed by the display of power and resources Alexander commands with a few terse instructions. That evening back at the penthouse, Alexander receives word that Philip tried to access the building's security footage through some contact he has, looking for patterns in my movements and schedules, searching for vulnerabilities in the protection Alexander has wrapped around me. Alexander's response is swift and multi-layered, legal and otherwise. He has his lawyers file for a restraining order with a thick file of evidence documenting Philip's stalking, and he has his own people deliver a more direct message that he won't detail no matter how much I press for information. His bloodied knuckles the next morning when he emerges from his study suggest he delivered at least part of that message personally, his right hand bruised across the tops and his expression savage with satisfaction. I tend to his hands at the kitchen island with careful touches and antiseptic that makes him hiss, our proximity intimate and tense as I wrap his knuckles in gauze, and I ask what he did to Philip in a voice barely above a whisper. Alexander says simply that Philip now understands the consequences of continuing, that some men only respect violence and pain, that words and legal documents mean nothing to someone who views another person as property to be reclaimed. But there is something else darkening his expression, a warning he received that changes the equation entirely. Richard Drummond, a rival with territorial disputes and ambitions that threaten Alexander's operations, knows about me now and sees me as leverage in a larger game I barely understand. Alexander's protection of me has painted a target on my back, in conflicts that have nothing to do with Philip, dangers I never anticipated when I kissed a stranger in a bar. The guilt crushing my chest must show clearly on my face because Alexander tips my chin up with his unbandaged hand, forcing me to meet his ice blue eyes as he tells me this is not my fault, that I am his responsibility now, and he protects what is his with every resource and weapon at his disposal. Security concerns intensify with each passing day until Alexander insists I take leave from the cafe because it is too public and too exposed, and I resist because I need that independence like oxygen, that small piece of my life that remains mine alone and untouched by his world. But an incident where a suspicious black sedan follows James and me on the way home one afternoon settles the argument with chilling finality. The car trailing us for 6 blocks before James loses it with evasive driving that leaves my heart hammering against my ribs. Confined to the penthouse, Alexander and I orbit each other like planets caught in gravitational pull, the forced proximity straining the careful boundaries we established and making the air between us feel charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. I discover his surprising domesticity in small moments, finding him cooking breakfast while handling business calls in 3 languages, his movements efficient and confident as he plates eggs and discusses shipping routes without missing a beat. He finds me reading in his study one afternoon and does not ask me to leave, instead settling at his desk and working in companionable silence that feels more intimate than conversation, both of us hyper-aware of the other's presence in the quiet room. Small touches become frequent and inevitable in the shared space, his hand at the small of my back when he passes me in the hallway, my fingers brushing his shoulder when I set coffee beside him while he works, each contact lasting a fraction too long to be accidental. The tension builds day by day until one evening when I find Alexander on his balcony overlooking the city, tension radiating from every line of his body as he grips the railing with white-knuckled intensity. A deal went wrong today. Someone he trusted betrayed him to Richard, and for a moment his careful control slips enough that I see the weight he carries, the crushing isolation of his position where everyone is either an asset or a threat, and nothing in between. I step close without thinking, offering silent comfort because words feel inadequate, and Alexander pulls me against his chest with desperate strength, his face buried in my hair as he holds on like I am an anchor in storm-tossed seas. We stand like that for long minutes while the city glitters below us, until his phone rings with news that the crisis has been managed and consequences delivered. He pulls back slowly, reluctance in every movement, but something fundamental has shifted between us in that moment of raw vulnerability. That night I wake to sounds from Alexander's room, the low groan of a nightmare perhaps, or something darker, and I hesitate in my doorway, knowing I should not go to him, should not cross this final line we have been dancing around for weeks. But my feet carry me down the hall anyway, and I find him awake, sitting on the edge of his bed in the darkness, still dressed in the pants and undershirt he wore to handle today's crisis, his head in his hands. I should not enter his bedroom, should not breach this last boundary between arrangement and something infinitely more complicated. But I do, sitting beside him on the expensive sheets, and Alexander looks at me like I am both salvation and destruction, hope and doom, wrapped in one fragile package. He cups my face with both hands, his touch achingly gentle, and asks in a voice gone rough if I know what I am offering by coming here. Clara is not entirely sure, knows only that the space between them has become unbearable, that the pretense of arrangement has worn thin as paper, that she wants him with an intensity that terrifies and compels in equal measure. When they kiss this time, there is no pretense and no performance, no audience to convince or role to play, only raw need and surprising tenderness. His hands in her hair and her arms around his neck as they fall back onto his bed and let the inevitable finally happen. I wake in Alexander's bed with morning light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows and his arm a warm weight around my waist, and reality returns with complicated intensity that makes my chest tighten, because last night shifted everything between us, crossed every boundary we had carefully maintained, and burned the pretense of arrangement to ashes. Alexander wakes moments after me, those ice-blue eyes opening and immediately searching mine with an intensity that steals my breath, looking for regret or rejection, or some sign that I will retreat back behind the walls we both erected. Clara has none about the intimacy itself, her body still humming with the memory of his hands and mouth and the surprising tenderness beneath the hunger. But everything about their arrangement suddenly feels infinitely more dangerous now because her heart is becoming involved when this was supposed to be temporary protection, a business transaction with clear boundaries and an eventual end. Alexander traces her face with fingers gone gentle, his thumb brushing her cheekbone as he admits in a voice gone rough with vulnerability that this was not the plan, but he cannot regret it. Cannot regret having her in his bed and his arms, even though it complicates everything they agreed to. The vulnerability in his voice undoes something in Clara's chest, making her lean into his touch and kiss him softly in answer, because words feel inadequate for what is building between them. Their morning intimacy is interrupted by sharp knocking and James entering without waiting for permission, his expression grim enough that Alexander sits up immediately with Clara pulling the sheet to her chest. James delivers urgent news with clinical efficiency. Philip filed a police report claiming Alexander's people assaulted him unprovoked, and he has lawyer involvement now, and worse, far worse. Richard Drummond made a move on one of Alexander's shipments last night, hijacking a container at the port and leaving 2 of Alexander's men hospitalized. Alexander must handle both situations immediately, the legal threat and the territorial challenge that cannot go unanswered without appearing weak. He is reluctant to leave Clara, his hand tightening on hers as he issues instructions to James about security, assigning multiple guards to watch the penthouse and her specifically. The day passes with tense slowness as Clara tries to process both the intimacy of last night and the escalating dangers Alexander faces. Eleanor visits in the afternoon, her security escort waiting outside, and she immediately notices Clara's emotional state with the perception of a best friend who has known her for 8 years. Clara confesses everything in the privacy of the guest room she no longer sleeps in, her confusion about real versus performed feelings, her fear that she is falling for a man whose world is built on violence and power, and dangers she barely understands. Eleanor surprises her by taking her hands and saying quietly that Alexander looks at Clara like she is his entire world, that whatever started as arrangement has become real for him too, that Eleanor saw it at the gala in the way he tracked Clara's every movement. That evening, Alexander returns exhausted and frustrated, tension radiating from every line of his body as he pours whiskey and explains that Philip's complaint was dismissed due to lack of evidence and witnesses who mysteriously changed their stories. But Richard is escalating in ways that demand response, demanding a meeting with terms that amount to surrender of territory. Alexander explains that Richard wants both territory and legitimacy, sees Alexander's legitimate business fronts as the prize that would let him expand and clean his money. Knowing about Clara gives Richard leverage in negotiations, a pressure point he can exploit. Alexander has a choice now: meet Richard's demands partially to avoid open conflict, or refuse and prepare for war that will be bloody and costly. Clara asks what he will do, already knowing the answer. Alexander's smile is cold and sharp as broken glass. He does not negotiate under threat, does not reward aggression with capitulation because that only invites more demands. But this means increased danger for everyone close to him, including her, especially her, now that Richard knows she matters. He offers again to send her somewhere safe until it is over, a property in another state with security, and the offer tears at Clara because she sees the fear beneath his controlled exterior. Clara refuses to leave, and the words come out harder than intended, sharper with fear and determination that makes Alexander's jaw clench with frustration, and something darker, something that looks like terror poorly masked. This angers him in a way she has not seen before, not the cold fury he directs at enemies, but hot, desperate anger born of fear, as he details the genuine danger Richard Drummond represents, a man without codes or limits, who burns businesses for insurance money and kills informants by leaving them in pieces as warnings, who views human life as currency to be spent. They argue in the middle of his study with the city lights glittering behind them, Alexander's fear manifesting as control and commands, Clara's hard-won independence clashing against the brutal reality of his world where threats are not abstract but immediate and bloody. She throws his own words back at him with shaking voice and steady eyes. She chose this, chose him, kissed a stranger in a bar, and followed him into danger, agreed to his arrangement, and fell into his bed and into something far more dangerous than Richard Drummond's threats. She will not run now, will not be shipped away like property, to be stored safely while he fights battles she helped create. Something in Alexander breaks at her words, the careful control fracturing as he closes the distance between them and grips her shoulders. Not gentle but not harsh either, just desperate. He admits in a voice gone rough that he is terrified of her getting hurt because of him, that she has become the vulnerability he spent his entire adult life avoiding, that every decision he makes now is colored by the thought of her in danger, and it is destroying his strategic thinking. Clara understands then with painful clarity. His control is not about dominance, but desperate protection. The only way he knows to keep safe the one thing in his world that matters more than territory or power or pride. She reaches up to cup his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, and tells him she is afraid too, more afraid than she has been even of Philip because the stakes are so much higher now. But she trusts him to keep her safe and needs him to trust her to be strong enough for this life she is choosing. The honesty between them is painful and necessary, stripping away pretense until they stand exposed in the dim study light. Alexander pulls her close with crushing strength, his face buried in her hair, extracting a promise in low tones that she will follow security protocols without argument, will not take unnecessary risks, will wear the tracker he gives her, and keep the panic button he is having made. Clara agrees to all of it because she understands compromise now, understands that love in his world requires both trust and precaution. The next 3 days pass in tense preparation as Alexander's organization mobilizes for potential conflict with Richard, and Clara sees the full scope of his operation for the first time. The loyal men who arrive for briefings, the strategic planning sessions in his study, the weapons being checked and distributed, the violence always simmering beneath the surface now brought to boil. James warns her privately that Richard might try to take her specifically to draw Alexander out, that she represents the perfect pressure point in negotiations. The fear is real and visceral, but Clara refuses to be the weak point that costs Alexander territory, or men, or worse. She insists on learning basic self-defense from James, who teaches her with patient brutality how to break holds and strike vulnerable points, and she practices security protocols until they become automatic. Never answer the door, always check the cameras, keep her phone charged and on her person, trust the guards Alexander assigned. Alexander watches these training sessions with mixed pride and concern in his eyes, saying nothing but pulling her close each evening like he is memorizing the feel of her. Then the anticipated move comes, but not against Clara. Eleanor. Richard's people grab Eleanor outside her office in broad daylight, and the call comes to Alexander's phone, while Clara sits beside him reviewing security footage. His expression goes carefully blank as he listens to demands delivered in cold, efficient tones. A meeting with Clara present at a location of Richard's choosing, or Eleanor dies slowly, and her body gets delivered in pieces. Clara's blood runs ice cold as she hears Eleanor's muffled crying in the background. Alexander is already mobilizing his people with rapid-fire instructions to James, but Richard chose the location and timing and has the advantage of preparation and position. Clara insists on going, and Alexander has no choice but to plan around her involvement, his jaw tight with barely controlled terror as he outfits her with a tracking device disguised as a bracelet, communication equipment hidden in her clothing, and a panic button embedded in the ring he slides onto her finger with hands that tremble almost imperceptibly. James briefs her on the warehouse location Richard chose, an abandoned industrial space near the docks with multiple exits and high catwalks that provide sniper positions, explaining that Alexander's men will be positioned outside, but cannot move in without risking Eleanor's life if Richard has her wired or guarded separately. The plan is extraction, not confrontation, getting both women out alive while avoiding the gang war that Richard wants to provoke. And Clara listens with focus that surprises even herself, memorizing details and contingencies while her heart pounds against her ribs. Alexander pulls her aside before they leave, his hands framing her face with desperate intensity as he makes her repeat the signals in safe words, his ice-blue eyes dark with fear he cannot quite mask. He tells her that if anything goes wrong, she runs and does not look back, does not wait for Eleanor, or try to be heroic, just runs to the extraction point James showed her on the map. Clara nods, but they both know she is lying, know that she will not leave Eleanor behind any more than Alexander would leave her. The drive to the warehouse takes 20 minutes through darkening streets, and Clara sits between Alexander and James in the back of the armored vehicle, Alexander's hand crushing hers with barely leashed violence directed at himself for allowing this. They arrive as sunset bleeds the sky red and orange, apocalyptic colors that match the dread churning in Clara's stomach. Richard's men are visible as shadows in the warehouse windows, at least 6 that Clara can count. Alexander walks her to the entrance, his body positioned to shield her, and for a moment his control fractures completely as he pulls her against him and breathes her in like he is memorizing her. He whispers against her hair that he will burn the city down if Richard hurts her, that there is nowhere the man could hide, and Clara believes him completely. Then he releases her, and she walks into the warehouse alone as agreed, her footsteps echoing on concrete, past rusting equipment and oil stains. Richard Drummond waits in the center of the space, a man in his 40s with cold eyes and expensive suit, and Eleanor is beside him with duct tape over her mouth and cable ties on her wrists, her eyes wide with terror that turns to horror when she sees Clara. Richard smiles, and it is a predator's expression, all calculation and cruelty. He thanks Clara for coming, his voice smooth and cultured, saying that Alexander Sinclair is easier to manage than his reputation suggests when you find the right pressure point. Clara's hands clench at her sides as she demands Eleanor's release, trying to project confidence she does not feel. Richard circles her slowly, appraising, and asks if she knows what she is worth, what territories and concessions Alexander will trade for her safe return. Clara realizes with cold clarity that Richard never intended a simple exchange, that this is about breaking Alexander's position and reputation, proving he can be controlled. Richard gestures, and 2 more men emerge from the shadows, and Clara's training kicks in as her thumb finds the panic button ring, pressing it 3 times in the pattern James taught her for immediate danger. The warehouse explodes into chaos as the panic signal activates, and Alexander's men breach 3 entrances simultaneously with coordinated precision, gunfire cracking through the air like thunder as Richard's people return fire from their positions, and Clara drops to the concrete floor, as James taught her, covering her head, while her heart hammers against her ribs, hard enough to bruise. Richard roars orders and grabs Eleanor as a shield, dragging her backward toward the rear exit with a gun pressed to her temple, and Clara sees her friend's terror, sees the calculation in Richard's cold eyes as he realizes his advantage is collapsing. Alexander appears through the smoke and dust like an avenging angel, his weapon drawn and his expression colder than Clara has ever seen it. All pretense of civilization stripped away to reveal the deadly man beneath, and his eyes find Clara on the floor with laser focus, before tracking to Richard with murderous intent. Richard shouts that he'll kill Eleanor if anyone comes closer, his voice high with rage and desperation, backing toward the exit, while his remaining men provide cover fire that pings off metal equipment and concrete pillars. Clara's training and fear war inside her as she realizes she's closer to Richard than anyone else, close enough to act if she's fast and brave and possibly stupid enough to try. Alexander is shouting something, his attention split between the firefight and Richard's retreat, and James is advancing from the left with two other men. But they're all too far, and Eleanor is crying behind the duct tape, and Clara can see Richard's finger tightening on the trigger. She moves without thinking, surging up from the floor and launching herself at Richard's gun arm the way James taught her, grabbing his wrist with both hands and wrenching it away from Eleanor's head with strength born of pure terror and determination. The gun discharges next to her ear, deafening her, and Richard backhands her with his free hand, sending her sprawling, but Eleanor is loose and stumbling away. Then Alexander is there with terrifying speed, his fist connecting with Richard's jaw in a hit that Clara feels in her bones, and Richard goes down hard. The remaining gunfire stops as Richard's men realize their employer is unconscious and outnumbered, weapons clattering to concrete in surrender. Clara's head is ringing and her face throbs where Richard hit her, but Alexander is lifting her with shaking hands, his face stark white beneath his tan, as he runs his hands over her body, checking for injuries, demanding to know if she's hurt. Clara can barely hear him through the ringing, but she sees the raw terror in his eyes, the way his hands tremble as they frame her face, and she understands that he aged years in the seconds she was in danger. James has Eleanor, cutting her restraints and checking her over with efficient gentleness while calling for medical support. And Alexander's other men are securing Richard's people with brutal efficiency that suggests this is not their first extraction. Alexander pulls Clara against him with crushing force, his face buried in her hair. And she feels him shaking, or maybe that's her own body finally catching up to what just happened. He's whispering things against her skin, words she can't quite hear but understands anyway. Relief and rage and love wrapped together. Richard groans on the floor nearby, and Alexander's expression shifts to something dark and final as he tells James to take the women to the cars, his voice carrying the promise of violence that Clara should probably protest but finds she cannot. Not for the man who threatened Eleanor and used them both as pawns. James drives them back to the penthouse in tense silence, while Eleanor sits wrapped in a blanket, trembling from shock and adrenaline, her wrists raw from the cable ties, and her eyes still wide with residual terror. Clara sits beside her friend, arm around her shoulders, feeling the weight of guilt settle like stones in her stomach because Eleanor was taken because of her, used as leverage in a game Clara dragged her into by accepting Alexander's protection. Alexander rides in the front passenger seat, his phone pressed to his ear as he issues clipped orders to people Clara cannot hear, coordinating cleanup and consequences, his voice cold and controlled in a way that suggests violence has already been decided and is simply being scheduled. When they arrive, Alexander disappears immediately into his study with James and three other men, the door closing with finality that tells Clara decisions are being made that she will not be part of. She takes Eleanor to the guest bathroom, helps her wash the adhesive residue from her face and wrists, finds clean clothes that hang loose on Eleanor's smaller frame, and makes tea that neither of them drinks. Eleanor finally speaks, her voice hoarse from screaming behind the tape, asking if this is Clara's life now, this constant danger and violence and men with guns. Clara has no answer that does not sound insane, no way to explain that yes, this is her life, and somehow she chose it, chose him. Eleanor sees something in Clara's expression, and her eyes go soft with understanding as she says that Alexander nearly tore that warehouse apart getting to them, that the look on his face when Clara threw herself at Richard was pure terror beneath the rage. Clara knows this, felt it in the way Alexander held her after, the trembling in his hands and the fractured control in his whispered words. Eleanor asks if Clara loves him, and the question hangs in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. Clara realizes with startling clarity that yes, she does. That somewhere between the desperate kiss in the bar and tonight's violence, she fell completely and irrevocably in love with a man who commands an empire built on fear and loyalty. The study door opens hours later, and Alexander emerges alone, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, his knuckles freshly split and swelling. He looks at Eleanor first, asking if she is hurt beyond what he can see, his voice gentler than Clara has heard it. Eleanor shakes her head and thanks him for coming for her, her voice small. Alexander nods once and says she will have permanent security assigned until Richard is completely handled, that she is under his protection now by extension of her connection to Clara. Then his eyes find Clara, and everything else falls away as he crosses to her with purpose, pulling her up from the couch and into his arms with desperate intensity. He buries his face in her hair, breathing her in like oxygen, and whispers against her skin that he cannot do this, cannot watch her throw herself into danger, cannot survive seeing her hurt. Clara feels him shaking and understands that Alexander Sinclair, the man who controls half the city's underworld, is breaking apart in her arms. She pulls back enough to frame his face with her hands, forcing him to look at her, and tells him that she is still here, still whole, still his if he wants her. Alexander's expression shifts to something raw and unguarded as he asks if she understands what that means, being his in truth, not arrangement. Clara says yes, she understands. She chooses it anyway, chooses him, and all the danger that comes with loving him. Alexander's expression when Clara speaks the words being his softens into something unguarded and devastating, all his careful control stripped away to reveal the longing beneath. And he kisses her with a reverence that steals her breath, his hands cradling her face like she is something infinitely precious and breakable. He pulls back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion as he tells her that she has been his since the moment she kissed him in that bar, that every day since has been him falling deeper while trying to maintain distance he no longer wants. Clara feels tears slip down her cheeks at the admission, at the mirror it holds to her own journey from desperation to protection to something far more consuming and permanent. Alexander kisses away her tears with a gentleness that contradicts everything his world represents, whispering against her skin that he will spend the rest of his life keeping her safe, giving her everything she wants, being worthy of the trust she has placed in him despite all logic. The words are a vow, a promise sealed with the kind of kiss that feels like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. Eleanor clears her throat softly from across the room, reminding them of her presence with obvious discomfort, and a small smile that suggests she is happy for Clara, despite the insanity of the situation. Alexander straightens, his arm remaining around Clara's waist as he tells Eleanor she should rest, that a room is prepared for her and security will be posted outside, that she is safe here. Eleanor nods and retreats with obvious relief, leaving Clara and Alexander alone in the aftermath of violence and confession. The penthouse feels different now, the space transformed from temporary shelter to something resembling home, though Clara knows the danger is not fully past. Alexander explains that Richard is being handled, that his organization is being systematically dismantled, that the man himself will face consequences that Clara does not need details about, but can imagine well enough. As for Philip, Alexander's expression hardens as he reveals that Philip made the mistake of trying to involve the police again, but Alexander's lawyers have buried him under evidence of stalking and harassment, and his family's money cannot save him from the restraining order now enforced with criminal penalties. Clara should feel triumph, but finds only exhaustion, the adrenaline and fear of recent weeks finally catching up, now that safety seems possible. Alexander sees it in her face and lifts her easily, carrying her toward his bedroom, despite her weak protest that she can walk. He settles her on the bed with careful tenderness, removing her shoes and pulling a blanket over her, his hands lingering with obvious reluctance to leave even for the necessary tasks still requiring his attention. Clara catches his hand, asking him to stay, needing his presence more than she needs answers or resolution. Alexander's smile is soft and surprised as he strips off his jacket and shoes, sliding into bed beside her and gathering her close with a sigh that sounds like relief and homecoming combined. Clara burrows into his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm, feeling safe for the first time since that night in the bar, when desperation made her kiss a dangerous stranger. Except Alexander is not a stranger anymore, is not just danger wrapped in expensive suits and cold control, but the man who broke apart in her arms and put himself back together with her help, who looks at her like she hung the moon and stars, who chose her just as surely as she chose him. Sleep pulls at Clara with heavy insistence, but she fights it, wanting to stay in this moment where everything feels possible and right, despite the violence that brackets their beginning. Alexander's hand strokes through her hair in soothing repetition, his voice a low rumble against her ear as he tells her to sleep, that he will be here when she wakes, that she never has to face anything alone again. The promise settles into Clara's bones like warmth, like truth, like the ending she never expected when she kissed a stranger to escape her past. Tomorrow will bring complications and adjustments. The reality of building a life with a man whose empire straddles darkness and light. But tonight, Clara lets herself simply be held by the man she loves, the Mafia boss who will never let her go, and discovers she has no desire whatsoever to be free.